everyone hear me? Yes, thank you. Good afternoon, Your Majesty, Your Excellencies, and creators and lovers of literature and the arts. It's a pleasure to be here. So our session right now is titled The Making of Angria, From Manuscript to Masterpiece. I think a lot of praises has already been sung about Angria while I was doing my research on the book. Just to read out a few that I found online. None other than Amitav Ghosh has said this about Angria, that it's an ambitious attempt to evoke the maritime world of the Konkan. The Telegraph has also said this about Sohail and Angria, that Sohail joins a league of writers who have put forward exceptional historical sagas. Finally, without boring the audience so much, there's another review that I read online about Angria where basically it says how it's an astounding debut. Angria is the tale of one of history's most feared naval commanders. Amid the smell of gunpowder and salt, Sohail Rekhy brings to life a momentous era when the war for Swaraj was fought on the seas of India. So I think that really, these praises really do justice to Angria. But for me, where I want to begin our conversation was, as I was finishing your book, Sohail, towards the end you have an acknowledgement page. And I just found the last sentence of the book very moving, where you thank a lot of people, including Chirag, who's helped bring the book to what it is right now. But the last line reads, I bow my head to my grandmother, the late Ratnavalia Aluwalia, who would narrate our never-ending epics to me every evening. I really like this sentence because this took me straight back to childhood. And where I want to begin our conversation for today is basically to ask both of you where your first encounter with the power of storytelling, this appetite that you developed for storytelling much later on, when was the first time you discovered this? So if you could just tell us about a moment that comes to your mind.
Congratulations, Your Majesty, for having us. I think in infancy, we are surrounded by stories. I think in all of Asia, it's part of our culture. And my grandmother used to tell me these rambling, unending Ramayans. But when it would end and she'd start a new one, she would focus on some other aspect, depending on maybe familial issues, what was going on in the house. So it was not only my grandmother, but my mother, my aunts, and we were a family of readers and of storytellers. So there was a lot of storytelling, I think, from when I was in my infancy, and it grew. And it was a good way of understanding a lot of things. I think stories which we tell our children and which we hear our parents are the most primal and basic explanations. Now my daughter asks me about things and I resort to the story. So it's come a full circle. And I think as humans, just the act of storytelling is so important.
Thank you. What about you, Chirag?
It's some of what he said also is something I shared in the family I come from. I grew up in Bombay, and I grew up with a huge appetite for theatre. We were all encouraged to create our plays, write our plays, put up cringe productions, act in them. So a lot of that initial idea of storytelling, becoming vessels for stories, came from being in the performance space, learning how to hold an audience, and taking people through a magic door, a magic portal, if you like, and creating a universe for them, a make-believe universe. So my earliest ideas of being fascinated by the idea of storytelling, and then to be sort of completely mesmerized by the idea of someone else's lived life, was through theater. Those would be my earliest influences.
Great. Thank you both. Now I kind of wanted to bring our conversation a little more directly onto your book. You know, I've read through a lot of your interviews and listened to a lot of the interviews you've given. You very lovingly refer to your protagonist as the Admirable Admiral. So could you just tell us a little bit more about how and where this first encounter with the Admirable Admiral was for you?
My granduncle was the commanding officer of a place called INS Angria, which is the Western Naval Command. And I used to do a fair bit of sailing around Mumbai, and there was a lighthouse there called Angria Lighthouse. Unfortunately, but I didn't know who Angria was. I had no idea. My first meeting with him was in 18th century English literature, where he was painted as a rapacious pirate. And, but it confused me. I was like, there's no way that the Indian Navy is going to name their Western Naval Command after a rapacious pirate. So I started looking deeper. But the first time I met him, I was actually searching for a pirate figure, and that's how I came across him. I was writing a children's book, and I did find my pirate. Just turned out later on that, no, he was the Admirable Admiral.
And maybe just to help relate this discussion to some of our young audiences, Kanoji Angria also makes a feature in Pirates of the Caribbean, right? Could you talk to us a little bit more about that?
Right. So around a decade ago, the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise came out, and in that you will remember a short, portly Indian with a high voice, and he is called Sambhaji Angria, which was Kanoji Angria's son's name, and that was how the story was originally written by John Biddulph in the 18th century. Had now reached Disney and the entire world. And here was him being presented as a comical figure.
Thank you. Now, I just want our discussion to sort of go a bit broad. So this novel is about a period of history in the 17th century, which for Bhutan as well was a very eventful century.
Yes.
With the arrival of Zhabdrung and everything that came after that. But just to help us appreciate this novel a bit more, could you help contextualize that period? Like, what were people doing at this period? So just paint us a landscape, if you will, of this period.
Sure. So this was the time of what was called the gunpowder empires, which was Turkey, Safavid Iran, Qing China, and Mughal India. And between the three eastern empires, Iran, Persia, China, and India, they controlled 80% of the world's GDP. You know, let that sink in, that up till 1757, these three empires, between 75 to 80% of the world's GDP. And they were the world's market, and of course you have heard of the Silk Route. There was a maritime route, and there was a terrestrial route, and the whole world wanted to come to India. It was called the Golden Bird. You know, and in Buddhist texts, they would say you need to be born 7 times and live a good life to be born in India. You know, so of course, growing up and in the past 200 years, that's been turned on its head. But this was a very fascinating period. And of course, it was the start of the age of the sail. It was, at that time, the prime meridian ran through Ujjain before it went to Paris and Greenwich, because the first solar observatories were in Ujjain, and at that time they had figured out the world was round, and that sun, it would be a different time. Of course, it was not being used till trains and ships, the age of sail came into being and led by Portugal. So it was an extremely fascinating time where the world was still very cosmopolitan, united. It took longer, of course, but it was still very united. And India, as it remains today, was an extremely diverse land. You know, it had given, you will find every religion, there is absolutely nothing. Tishani was talking about the gender debate. Unfortunately, we have become patriarchal, but in our gods, gender is a very fluid thing.
Yeah.
Almost all gods there's a male and a female, and so gender was very fluid back then.
Thank you for painting sort of a broad picture. At the risk of not making my guest feel like he's the third wheel in our conversation, my next question is towards you. Sohail is writing about this kingdom, about this character that is no more, about a kingdom that's no more actually, about this bygone era, bygone kingdom. So my question to you is, why do you think Indians, but not only Indians, the world at large, Bhutanese people, care about this bygone era since it's no more?
Yeah, no, that's a fascinating story, and thank you for that question. There's various ways to sort of approach how one could go about answering this question, right? Wherever our place in terms of location, our cultural sensibilities, our socializations, whatever those journeys may be, we are made up of our collective histories. The fact that we are here today is because of a certain context, because of a certain continuity, because of a certain contestation. And history is, in a way, is a contestation over power, over truth, over myth-making. And empires and kingdoms gone by, nations that are no more around, communities that have been liquidated, people from our past, if we look to them, have a lot to tell us about the choices that we can make in our present and the futures we will collectively build and craft together. So here in a landlocked country, if one were to think about this sort of novel, which is set in 17th century coastal Konkan Indian region, you also, in a way you think about this protagonist, Kanoji Angre, and the things that, drove him. At the end of the day, I think what makes all of us human is our ability to relate with one another. It's our deep ability to be horrible, as Teshani pointed us in the earlier session, but also deeply empathetic. So stories that we may not have lived, literature is able to bring to life for us. And all these protagonists have the same kind of compulsions, the same kind of choices that a lot of us face in our lives. They're driven by similar sort of aspects of ambition and fear and anxiety, deceit, friendship, betrayal, and the choices that people made in various empires or various places in history, various protagonists of the times that we didn't live through, may perhaps offer answers, solutions, hidden sort of messages, if you like, for the choices that we must make, if we must make them.
Yeah. I think I agree with that very much myself as well. Even though growing up in a landlocked country, I think I was always moved by the power of literature to take you to these different universes that you could otherwise never access, right? So thank you, Abad. Coming back to you, Sohail, kind of wanted to go back a little bit to our earlier conversation about how you found Kanoji Angre painted, portrayed as a pirate. And in one of the interviews that I read up on, you talked about how you had been to this Underi fort many times. And even though you had gone there many times, that you had never heard of this Kanoji Angre. And even when you did, that he was painted as this sort of money-grabbing, looting, violent pirate. And over there, you talked about how that bothered you a lot. Could you tell us a bit more about why you were so bothered with this characterization of Kanoji Angre?
Well, primarily because it was absolutely false. And it was, manipulating the narrative. The East India Company painted him out to be a pirate because That was the way they were going to fund the Bombay Marine, which later on became the Indian Navy. Though he was the legitimate admiral of the Marathas, and he was also the governor of the Konkan. What really surprised me, not only was that, okay, that he was painted into a pirate, but so few Indians knew about the real Kanoji Angre. You know, we have been sailing to, like I was telling you, Kandheri Fort, but we didn't know who built it or who commanded it, what purpose it served. And when I started doing my research, he was an astounding figure. You know, it was surprising for such a modern cosmopolitan man to be around in the 17th century. You know, we always have this impression of ourselves as superstitious, non-modern, non-technological, right? Or fighting technology, Luddite, you know, at some level. But this gentleman was not. He was, had foresight enough to plant teak trees, you know, innovate naval strategy, mint coins, and not gold muhars with his face on it, but simple silver rupees to increase currency and stimulate the economic welfare of his people. So he was a very forward-thinking and someone any South Asian can be proud of. And I just want to kind of rectify that and resurrect the true Kanoji Angre.
Thank you. My next one, I think I'd like to direct to Chirag. So right now, Sohail has just talked to us about the power of narrative and the power to shape narrative based on who's writing these stories, right? Could you talk to us a bit more in your role as an editor at a publishing house? Do you see the value of literature to right historical wrongs, to help maybe move forward the cause of social justice?
Yeah, that's again a fascinating question. And in continuity with what you said, I feel like literature and us at the curatorial sort of gatekeeping doors of what will one day be the history of literature, the history of culture, in deciding what we publish and also deciding what we're going to say no to. So essentially we're midwives for what will one day be the canon, right? And when Sohail's novel came along in my inbox when it landed, I knew that I had to sort of say yes to this. Because I too was guilty of not knowing enough about Kanoji Angre or not paying enough attention to this chapter, a glorious chapter in the pages of India's history. You'll be surprised how many people within the sort of larger historical canon and canvas of the Indian world of books and literature, Kanoji has not had the kind of place that he deserved. So it was interesting, it was necessary for me to pick this book up, and I'm only glad I did. So I had great sort of fun and joy editing it and publishing it. But to your larger question of you know, what role does literature serve in righting wrongs in social justice, of course, it has the burden to offer counterfactuals. It has the burden to offer counter-narratives. So much of the South Asian and the Indian history is filled with the burden of colonialism. Right? Earlier, when you guys mentioned that he was actually not seen as the great naval commander he was, but as a regular person of color, pirate, with the only motivations that he had was looting and money and, you know, grabbing power, etc. And that, you know, if you think about it, if you contextualize it, it's very much in line with the history of how the East has always been seen, right? The colonial masters, and even before, you know, our histories of colonizations, we've had travelers who looked to the East as exotic lands of peoples and cultures who are snake charmers and have great music and wear colorful clothes, who are not capable of complexities, people who are ahistorical, people without histories, people without song, people without stories. And they painted a lot of the East that they found as these exotic lands as flattened cultures, as flattened societies, as flattened communities and people. So a lot of the literature that post-colonies produce, that we produce, have the burden of righting those wrongs.
Rigsar, there is a Maasai saying, until the lion doesn't learn how to write, the story will always glorify the hunter.
Yeah. And I think to bring it back to this festival, this just goes on to show the importance of such a platform, right? Because it is only through these platforms, through telling and retelling these stories, that we're able to show the complexity that is within the lived human experience. The next section I kind of wanted to delve before our time ends is what I found very interesting about this book is, even the title itself, right? It's Angria, a Historical Odyssey. And I think it would be right to characterize this novel as a unique blend of history and fiction. So my question is, how much of Angria is historical? How much of it is fiction? Does the fiction take away from its historical authenticity and the power that it has, or vice versa? So if you could speak a little bit about why you chose this particular stylistic choice to write this novel. Yeah, maybe we can start with you, and then you could perhaps add.
I just had a few pieces of the puzzle. I did a lot of research, but most of it was secondary sources, and I did not have the full story. And I wanted to develop his character. I wanted to develop him from his childhood, which we knew absolutely nothing about, other than that he may have gone to this school or he did go to that school. So then I started creating, a character arc as to how did he become such, how did he become Kanoji Angre, the Sohail, the admiral? What led him to be what he was, behave what he was, which was also, he was very different from other Maratha Sardars, He lived a very austere, simple life. His wives were always complaining because he didn't spend enough on them or on himself. And he would spend money on practice, artillery practice, which was unheard of. It was, the system was based on commission and it was to make profit at some level. But he went totally against the grain. So I had to come up with a reasonable and rational explanation for that. So I did resort to creating a lot of, maybe going backwards and creating a character and to try to explain him. And of course, history is, Chirag has been telling me to get into history, non-fiction. But the canvas, non-fiction, a fiction novel provides is immense, little details which would be impossible for me to extract now. It's going to be 300 years since his death soon. And also someone who was crushed by his descendants were destroyed by the British. So people who prior to the mutiny lost out to the British, they are lost, in history. So quite frankly, I did not have enough information to call it, honestly, that it's a non-fiction piece of work. I just wanted the spirit.
Yeah, I think we're almost at the end of time. Maybe a quick addition to whatever's missing before we move to Q&A.
Sure. I think that your question pertains to putting fact and fiction on bed together. It's a tricky one. I think I understand the challenges of the historian who has to dig through destroyed archives and paint a picture of a time that they may not have lived through. And fiction sometimes comes in as a place you seek refuge in order to sort of create a story from that time. And I think some amount of liberties that fiction gives you, I think allows you to sort of then interrogate motivations of those characters and things that guided them in making the choices they did. It's a tricky one. Either way, I think my challenge that I have thrown at Sohail is the next historical work he does is in the non-fiction space, which I would love to publish. But of course, this is entirely up to him. But even if he did a novel next, I think that is something I might greatly enjoy.
Great. Well, thank you so much for this
Thank you, Rigsar.
very lovely conversation. Now, we'd like to open our conversation to the floor. So I see a hand way at the back. So if someone could get the mic.
Hello. First of all, I would like to thank Her Majesty for organizing these events, for the creation of this event. So we students have the opportunity to learn so much from here. And thank you, sir, for giving me insight on these books, because I never knew that there was a famous admiral that led the Maratha Navy against the British. So, sir, my question would be for you is that since you are practically an expert in the case of Angria, I want to ask you, sir, what do you think will happen if Angria did not exist, sir? Will the Maratha Empire fall faster? Will it be an ally with the British? Or what if he allied with the British instead? I just want some insight on this, sir. Thank you.
The Maratha Swarajya was actually a confederacy led by Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj. So there were many generals. And of course, Kahnoji himself was able to secure the coast for a period of him and his two elder sons for a period of at least 60 to 80 years. If he hadn't existed, things would have been different. Had he gone against the Confederacy, things would have been different. So yes, there is something like this we can do, a work of what if someone wasn't there. And it would be very interesting to think of Mahatma Gandhi. What would have happened to India if there was no Mahatma Gandhi? But just having found that person, to think about whether he had not existed or had chosen a different path, it is a fascinating question. But if we were to take, say, someone like Mahatma Gandhi and write a history, a what-if history of India, that is a possibility, of course.
Anything to add? No. Okay. Any other questions? See a lady over here.
Thank you. So Sohail, this question is for you. Writing a novel like this, when an author writes about a character, obviously a relationship develops between the author and the character themselves. There's a relationship that grows. So my question to you is, from the time you began writing and by the time you finished writing, how have you changed as a person? And how has the character influenced you?
Well, quite a philosophical question. Yes, you always learn, I find history fascinating because it has a tendency to repeat itself. And the distance it gives us also enables greater objectivity. So when we can always study history to understand contemporary politics or our country today, India or South Asia. And I learned a lot about Maratha history. Growing up, we were always taught that the British, received India on a platter from the Mughals. But actually there's a thing called the forgotten Maratha century between, the fall of the Mughal Empire and the British Raj. And that was when what the Marathas controlled from Attock in Afghanistan to Cuttack in Orissa, and all the way down to Tanjavur, where till today the royal family of Tanjavur are descendants of Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj. So I did learn a lot about Maratha history, and I have really come to respect Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj. Kanoji Angre based his life and was very loyal to Chhatrapati's family, but also he used Chhatrapati as a role model. And you learn that Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj was a brilliant man, a brilliant king, and he too has been done a lot of injustice. Because I think also from India, you would remember how, they would disparage him, mountain rat, this, that, when none of it is true. So,
as the moderator, I'd like to take the privilege, actually. Chirag, you're also a writer, an editor in your own right. Could you speak a little bit about your own writing process and how that, to borrow her question, has there been a piece of writing that's changed you as a person?
To answer the first part of your question, given my day job, which is midwifing the birthing of other people's stories they carry with them, characters that they sort of conjure up from history or from creative processes and processes of imagination and characters, then they carry with them and that stay with them. Oftentimes, our jobs is to then be the exorcist for our writers, because we have to then give them the reality check and tell them to distance themselves now that the text has been written, and hand it over to someone else so that they have time away from this almost kind of sense of possession that the writer goes through at the time of crafting that story. And then sort of to edit it and polish it and develop it and take it out into the world and let it do its own dance and fly, right? So that's the day job. I lack the discipline for long-form writing, given that a lot of what I do is read and publish long-form. So a lot of my writing practice, has to do with the form of the essay. It speaks most to me. I enjoy the brevity and the economy of the essay. And a lot of the writing I tend to do, is in the space of culture, pop culture, cinema, the arts. And I am a reactive writer. So things happen and I tend to sort of respond to them. So a lot of the essays that I do stem from a place of urgency, something that may happen in culture. And a lot of the essays I do are basically responses to those.
Great, thank you. We are out of time, but is there any last final thoughts you just want to get across? If you haven't been able to get it off your chest, now's the moment. If not, we can close the session and then hand it over to the next.
No, I'd just like to thank Her Majesty again for this wonderful opportunity. And really, the festival has gone from strength to strength, and really proud to be a part of it.
It's been a pleasure to share this stage with two amazing guys. Thank you so much.